Hey there and welcome back. If the day is finally done and the lamp is low and the house has gone quiet around you, then you have come to the right place, and there is nothing left for you to do tonight but settle and let your breathing slow and allow yourself to be carried gently back across 500 years into another age. Tonight, I want to tell you about a woman whom history very nearly forgot, a woman who stood at the very centre of the most famous family of her age, and yet has been left, for most of 5 centuries, in the shadows at its edge. You will recognise her family even if you do not know her. You will know her sister, almost certainly, for her sister was Anne Boleyn, the second of Henry VIII's 6 wives, the one who was crowned and then beheaded, whose rise and fall shook a kingdom and changed the course of English history forever. But Anne had an elder sister, a sister who came before her in everything, who went to the king before Anne ever did, who tasted the dazzle of the court and the favour of 2 crowns before her younger sister rose to eclipse her entirely. Her name was Mary Boleyn, and hers is one of the strangest and gentlest and, in the end, one of the most fortunate stories of that whole glittering and terrible age. For while her sister was crowned queen and then destroyed, while her brother went to the block and her family was shattered, Mary, the forgotten one, the one cast out and left behind, was the one who lived. And there is a secret in her story, a thing almost nobody remembers, which is this: the blood that runs in the veins of the kings and queens of England today does not come down from the famous sister who wore the crown. It comes down from the forgotten one. It comes down from Mary. Before we go back to find her, let me say the few small things I always like to say at the start. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, whether there is rain at the window or snow on the sill, or only the deep, soft dark of a late and quiet hour. If you find a kind of peace in these slow journeys into the past, then you are very welcome to subscribe, so that the next of these long evenings finds its way to you when you have need of one, and you are always welcome to leave a note in the comments, for I look through them often, and there is a quiet joy in seeing how a story 5 centuries old can gather people together from every corner of the earth into the same hushed and shared and sleepy room at the close of the day. That is all. The lamp is low, the door is shut, and the night is yours. So let your shoulders drop, and let the day loosen its hold, and come back with me now to England at the very start of the 1500s, to a rising house and a castle in the green Kentish hills. Picture this: the county of Kent, in the southeast of England, in the first years of the 1500s, a soft and rolling country of orchards and hop gardens, of woods and streams and little stone villages, of green hills folding away toward the sea. And there, set among its moated grounds in a quiet wooded valley, a small and beautiful castle called Hever, the home of the Boleyns, a double-moated manor of mellow stone with its gatehouse and its great hall and its panelled chambers, the kind of comfortable, well-appointed gentleman's castle that spoke of a house on the rise. For the Boleyns were a clan very much on the climb. They were not ancient nobility, not dukes or earls with royal blood and vast estates going back to the conquest, but they were clever and ambitious, and exceptionally well connected, climbing steadily, generation by generation, from trade into land, and from land into the highest circles of the court. And it was here, at Hever, or in the years around the turn of the century, that the children of the family were born and raised, among them the 2 sisters whose names would one day be known across the world, and a brother who would share their fate. Mary and Anne and George Boleyn. To understand Mary, you must first understand the family that made her, for the Boleyns were a particular kind of family, and their relentless ambition shaped the whole course of her life and the lives of all her kin. The man at the head of the family was her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, and he was one of the most able and ambitious men of his age, a courtier and diplomat of real gifts, fluent in languages, skilled in the delicate arts of the court, trusted with embassies abroad, climbing always toward greater favour and greater reward. He was charming and clever and cold, a man who saw in his children, and especially in his daughters, instruments of the family's advancement, assets to be positioned and matched and used to lift the family higher. And he had wed well, for Mary's mother was Elizabeth Howard, a daughter of one of the foremost noble lines in all of England, the Howards, Dukes of Norfolk, so that the children of that union carried in their veins both the climbing ambition of the Boleyns and the ancient blood of the high nobility. It was a powerful combination, and Thomas Boleyn meant to make the most of it. If her father's side gave Mary her restless drive, her mother's gave her something older and, in the end, more enduring, for through her she carried the blood of one of the foremost lines in England, a connection that shaped the family's whole trajectory in ways worth understanding. Elizabeth Howard was no daughter of rising merchants climbing toward respectability, but sprang from an ancient and powerful line, the Dukes of Norfolk, among the very highest of the old nobility, with royal blood in their veins and vast estates, and a pride to match their lineage. For a courtier still making his way upward, to win a daughter of that house was a notable coup, a match far above what his own birth might have commanded, and it brought him a tie to the heights of the aristocracy that would prove enormously valuable. His children, Mary and Anne and George, were thus not merely the offspring of a clever courtier, but the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of dukes, carrying the ancient descent of the high nobility in their very veins. This Howard connection mattered greatly, for it placed the Boleyn children within the orbit of one of the most powerful political families in the kingdom, and it gave them a standing and a set of connections that a mere courtier's children could never have claimed. The head of the Howard clan in Mary's day was her uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, a hard and ruthless and immensely powerful man, one of the dominant figures of the age, and his patronage and his interest were a valuable asset to the rising family. It was partly through such connections that the family climbed so high so fast, the Boleyn ambition married to the Howard power, the two together lifting Mary and her siblings toward the dazzling heights they would reach. And it was a measure of the cold and calculating nature of that realm that when the Boleyns finally fell, their Howard uncle, who had helped them rise, would sit in judgment upon his own nieces and nephew, presiding over the trials that condemned Anne and George to death, sacrificing his own kin to preserve himself and his house. The same connections that had lifted the Boleyns up did nothing to save them when they fell. Of Elizabeth Howard herself, the mother of the famous siblings, we know remarkably little, for like so many women of her age, she left little mark upon the records. Her life lived in the shadow of her husband and her children. She seems to have spent much of her time at the family home, bearing and raising her children, managing the household, while her husband pursued his career at court and abroad. She would have overseen the early upbringing of her daughters, their first education, their training in the accomplishments expected of gentlewomen, before they were sent out into society at large to be finished and placed and married. There is scant record of her relationships with her children, little to tell us whether she was a warm mother or a distant one, whether she grieved the terrible fate that befell two of her 3 children or accepted it with the hard fatalism of her age. She outlived her famous daughter Anne, dying a few years after the catastrophe, and we can only imagine what those last years were like for a woman who had seen 2 of her children destroyed upon the scaffold. But through Elizabeth Howard, she carried something that would prove in the long run more enduring than all her father's ambition, for the Howard descent, mingled with the Boleyn, would flow down through Mary's children and her children's children, down the long generations, carrying the inheritance of both those houses into the future. It is one of the quiet ironies of the story that the ancient Howard nobility and the rising Boleyn ambition joined in the marriage of Thomas and Elizabeth, found their most enduring expression not through the famous and doomed Anne, whose line ended with her childless daughter, but through the obscure and forgotten Mary, whose descendants would carry that mingled blood all the way to the throne of England. The grand marriage of the ambitious courtier and the Duke's daughter bore its most lasting fruit through the child of theirs, who mattered least in their own eyes, the elder daughter who threw away her advantages for love and was forgotten, and whose blood, in the end, outlasted them all. The family's rise had been the work of generations, and it is worth pausing on, for it tells you something about the world she was born into and the pressures that would shape her. Her great-grandfather had been a merchant, a man of trade who had made money and bought land and wed upward, beginning the long climb. Her grandfather had risen further into the gentry, into royal service, marrying into the nobility, and her father carried the family higher still into the inner circles of the court, into diplomacy and royal favour, his eyes fixed always on the next rung of the ladder. This was a family that had clawed its way up from the merchant class to the edge of the aristocracy in 3 generations, and that did not mean to stop climbing. Every marriage was a calculation, every child a potential asset, every connection a step toward greater things. And the daughters of such a family, Mary and Anne, were raised with the clear understanding that their purpose was to serve the family's ambition, to be placed advantageously, to marry well, and if fortune allowed, to catch the eye of the high and the powerful. It was the way of their world, and she grew up inside it, a daughter of the rising Boleyns, destined to be used, one way or another, for the glory of her name. Let me take you back, for a while, to the childhood years at Hever, before the court and the king and all the drama that would consume the family, for there is something worth pausing on in that early innocence. Picture the 3 of them there together in the wooded Kentish valley, Mary and Anne and George, children at play in the years before any of them could dream of crowns or scaffolds or the terrible turns their lives would take. They were simply a brother and 2 sisters then, growing up side by side, sharing the small world of a country childhood, bound by the ordinary closeness of siblings. None of the dark future had yet cast its shadow. The girl who would be queen, and the girl who would be forgotten, and the boy who would die beside his sister, were, for those few short years, just children of one house, and it is tender and sorrowful to hold them in the mind. So, at the threshold of everything, knowing what they did not, we can imagine something of that childhood, even though the records tell us little, for the life of a gentry family's children in such a place followed certain familiar patterns. There would have been the early years in the care of nurses and servants, the gradual beginning of education, lessons in reading and writing, and the accomplishments expected of well-born children. The girls would have learned the skills considered proper for gentlewomen, needlework and music and dancing, and the management of a household, along with their letters and perhaps some French, in preparation for the courtly life that awaited them. There would have been the rhythms of country life, the changing seasons, the festivals and holy days, the comings and goings of a busy household, and there would have been the company of brothers and sisters, Mary and Anne and George growing up together, close in age, sharing the world of their childhood before the diverging paths of their adult lives carried them to such different fates. It is poignant to think of those 3 children at Hever, in the innocence of their early years, knowing nothing of what lay ahead. There they were, Mary and Anne and George playing in the gardens and learning their lessons and growing up together in the peace of the Kentish countryside, 3 children of a rising family, full of the ordinary hopes and fears of childhood. And ahead of them lay such extraordinary and such terrible destinies, the dizzy rise and the bloody fall, the crown and the scaffold, the dazzling heights and the annihilating ruin. 2 of those 3 children, the laughing children of Hever, would die upon the executioner's block, brought down in horror and disgrace. And the 3rd, Mary, would alone survive, would alone live out her years in peace, would alone grow old and die quietly in her bed. None of it could have been foreseen in those early years at Hever, when they were simply children together, and there is a deep sadness in the contrast between that innocent beginning and the dark destinies that awaited them. Hever itself outlived the family that had cherished it, passing out of Boleyn hands after the catastrophe, when the family was ruined and its property scattered. The beautiful castle in the Green Valley, where the doomed children had played, went on without them, as places do, indifferent to the human dramas that had unfolded within its walls. It stands to this day, that lovely manor, in its double moat, a monument to the family that rose and fell so spectacularly, and visitors come to it still, to walk where the Boleyns walked, to imagine the children who grew up there, and the fates that awaited them. But of those three children, it is Anne who draws the visitors. Anne, the famous queen, her story told and retold within those walls, while Mary, who played in the same gardens and learned in the same chambers, is barely mentioned, the forgotten sister overlooked even in the home of her childhood. And yet it was Mary, of the three children of Hever, who alone found the happiness and the peace that the beautiful place seems to promise, the one who alone lived to grow old, Mary whose blood alone endured. The forgotten child of Hever was the fortunate one in the end, however little the spot that made her remembers it. Let me tell you more about Mary's father, for Sir Thomas Boleyn was one of the most remarkable and one of the coldest figures of his age, and to understand him is to understand the forces that shaped and used his daughters. He was by any measure an exceptionally able man. He had a gift for languages, speaking French with such fluency that he could hold his own among the most polished courtiers of Europe, and he had a diplomat's instinct for the delicate arts of negotiation and persuasion. These talents made him valuable to the crown, and he was sent again and again on embassies abroad, to the courts of France and the Low Countries, and the Holy Roman Empire, representing his king and advancing, with every mission, his own fortunes. He was charming when charm was useful, shrewd always, and tireless in the pursuit of advancement, the very model of the new kind of courtier who rose not by ancient blood or feats of arms, but by service and skill, and the patient accumulation of royal favour. But there was a coldness at the heart of Thomas Boleyn, a calculating quality that makes him hard to like across the distance of 5 centuries, for he seems to have regarded his own children, and especially his daughters, chiefly as instruments of the family's advancement. This was not unusual in his age, when marriages among the great were matters of property and alliance rather than affection, and when daughters in particular were assets to be deployed for the good of the house. But Thomas Boleyn pursued the advancement of his family with a single-mindedness that strikes even by the standards of his time, placing his daughters where they might catch the eye of the powerful, profiting from their royal connections, and showing, when the catastrophe finally came, a chilling readiness to abandon them to save himself. When his daughter Anne and his son George were arrested and condemned, Thomas Boleyn did nothing to defend them, made no protest, raised no hand to help, but bent every effort to preserving his own position and his own skin. It is one of the most unlovely aspects of the whole Boleyn tragedy, the father who had used his children to climb and then watched them die without lifting a finger, and it tells us something about the family that made Mary, and about the age she eventually chose to escape. The ambition that drove Thomas Boleyn was the ambition of his whole class and his whole age, the restless upward striving of the new men who were remaking English society in the years of the early Tudors. The old order, the world of the great feudal nobility with their ancient titles and their vast inherited estates, was giving way to a new and more fluid world, in which clever and capable men could rise through service to the crown, through education and skill, and the patient cultivation of favour. The Boleyns were exactly such a family, risen from trade to gentry to the edge of the aristocracy in 3 generations, and Thomas Boleyn embodied the type to perfection, the self-made man of the court, climbing always, never satisfied, his eyes fixed on the next prize. For such a man, a daughter who caught the king's eye was not a scandal to be lamented, but an opportunity to be seized, and the rise of first Mary and then Anne into the king's favour was, to Thomas Boleyn, the chance of his life, the chance that might lift his family to heights beyond his wildest hopes. And for a time it did. As his daughters rose, so did Thomas Boleyn, showered with titles and offices and lands, made a viscount and then an earl, raised to the high nobility on the strength of his daughter's royal connections. At the height of the Boleyn ascendancy, when Anne was queen and her father stood among the greatest men in the kingdom, it must have seemed that the long climb had reached its summit, that the patient ambition of generations had been crowned at last. But it was all built on the most unstable of foundations, on the favour of a king whose desires were as changeable as the weather, and when that favour turned, the whole structure came crashing down, and Thomas Boleyn, who had risen so high on his children, lost them both in a single bloody week, and spent his last years in disgrace and diminishment. His great ambitions turned to ashes. There is a hard lesson in his life about the price of building one's fortunes on the favour of the powerful, and about the difference between Thomas Boleyn, who staked everything on grandeur and lost, and his daughter Mary, who turned her back on grandeur, and, in doing so, saved herself. We do not know for certain which of the 2 sisters was the elder, Mary or Anne, and it is one of the small mysteries of her life, debated by historians down the centuries. But the weight of the evidence, and the judgment of most who have studied the question, suggests that she was the firstborn, the daughter who came first in everything and was overtaken in the end by the younger. There is a particular poignancy in that, if it is true, for it means that she was the one meant to lead the senior daughter on whom the family's first hopes were placed, and that she watched her younger sister climb past her to a height she herself had once approached and lost. But whatever the order of their birth, the 2 girls were close in age, raised together in the same household, given the same upbringing, prepared together for the same destiny of advantageous marriage and courtly advancement. And when the chance came for one of them to be sent abroad to the most glittering court in Europe, to be polished and finished and made into a perfect ornament of the courtly court, it was she who went first. For in the year 1514, when she was perhaps 14 or 15 years old, a rare opportunity opened for the Boleyn family, and she was chosen to seize it. The King of England, Henry VIII, then a young man newly come to his throne, had arranged for his younger sister, the Princess Mary Tudor, to marry the elderly King of France, Louis XII, in one of the major diplomatic marriages of the age. A household of English ladies was to accompany the princess to France, to attend her in her new life as queen of that country, and a place in that household was a glittering prize, a chance to be at the very centre of the most sophisticated court in Europe. Thomas Boleyn, with his diplomatic connections and his relentless ambition, secured a place for his daughter Mary, and so the girl was sent across the sea to France to begin her education in the dazzling and dangerous European court. The marriage of Mary Tudor to the old French king did not last long, for Louis XII was elderly and frail, and he died within a few months of the wedding, leaving his young English bride a widow almost before she had begun. The princess returned to England, where she would shortly make a love match of her own that scandalized and delighted the courts of Europe. But Mary Boleyn did not return with her. Instead, she stayed on in France, transferred into the household of the new French queen Claude, the gentle and pious wife of the new king, the dashing and magnificent and notoriously amorous Francis I. And so she remained at the French court, that brilliant and sophisticated and morally dangerous station, through her later teens, the most impressionable years of her young life, absorbing its arts and its manners and its dazzle, and exposed, too, to its temptations and its perils. It is here, in her French years, that the first shadow falls across Mary's story. For the French court of Francis I was a place of extraordinary glamour and extraordinary license, and Mary, a young and attractive Englishwoman far from home, seems to have come to grief in it in some fashion. The records are thin, and the truth is hard to recover at this distance, but there are later reports, repeated and embroidered by her enemies and by gossiping chroniclers, that she became entangled in liaisons at the French court, and even, in the most damaging of the stories, that she caught for a time the roving eye of the French king himself. We must be careful here, for much of what was later said about Mary's time in France comes from hostile sources, written long afterward by people with reason to blacken her name, and it may be exaggerated or invented entirely. What seems likely is that the young Mary, in the heady and permissive air of that court, acquired a reputation, deserved or not, that would follow her for the rest of her life, the reputation of a woman who had been free with her favours, the elder Boleyn's sister, whose conduct abroad had not been all that it should have been. Whatever the truth of it, by the time she returned to England, she carried with her the faint and damaging whisper of scandal, and it would colour the way her own age, and the ages after, would see her. Let us linger a while in France, in the years when she was growing up at the most brilliant court in Europe, for those years shaped her profoundly, and the world she lived in there was a marvel and a peril both. The France of Francis I was the very heart of the Renaissance in the north of Europe, a court of dazzling sophistication and culture, where art and learning and beauty were prized above all things, where the new ideas and the new styles flowing out of Italy found their most magnificent expression north of the Alps. Francis himself was the embodiment of the Renaissance prince, tall and handsome and charismatic, a patron of artists and scholars, a lover of beauty in all its forms, who drew to his court the finest painters and poets and thinkers of the age, and who made his palaces into showcases of magnificence. To be at such a court was to be at the cutting edge of European civilization, immersed in the most refined and cultured society in the world, and for a young Englishwoman it was an education beyond price. Mary served in the household of the French queen, Claude, the gentle and pious and much pregnant wife of the magnificent king, and in that household she would have learned all the arts that a court lady needed. She would have perfected her French, learned to move and speak and carry herself with the elegance that the French court demanded, absorbed the music and the dancing and the poetry, the codes of courtly love and courtly manners, the whole sophisticated apparatus of Renaissance court culture. She would have learned to dress, to converse, to charm, to navigate the subtle currents of a great court. This was the finishing school of European royalty, and she spent her most formative years in it, emerging polished and accomplished, a young woman of genuine courtly sophistication, fit to shine in any court in Europe. The girl who returned to England was a very different creature from the child who had left it, and the difference was the work of France. But the French court was also, for all its beauty and culture, a place of notorious moral license, and this was the peril that lay alongside the education. Francis I was famous, even infamous, for his amorous adventures, a king who pursued women with the same energy and appetite he brought to art and war, and his court took its tone from its king. It was a position of gallantry and seduction, of love affairs and intrigues, where the codes of courtly love shaded easily into something less idealized, and where a young and attractive woman was exposed to temptations and pressures of every kind. For a girl in her teens, far from home and family, in a court where such things were the common currency of life, The dangers were real, and it seems that she, in some fashion that we cannot now recover with certainty, succumbed to them, or was thought to have succumbed, acquiring the reputation that would shadow her for the rest of her days. And there is a point here worth pressing, one that the chroniclers of her own age would never have thought to make. Mary was a girl, perhaps 14 or 15 when she went abroad, alone in a court ruled by grown and powerful men who took what they wanted from the young women around them and suffered no consequence for it. If she was drawn into something there, she was drawn by men who held every advantage of age and rank and power over her, and yet it is her name, not theirs, that the centuries have stained. This is the oldest and most unjust of double standards, that the girl bears forever the shame of what the man does and walks away from, and Mary bore it, fairly or not, for the rest of her days. When we weigh the whispers that followed her, we should weigh them on that scale, remembering how little power a girl in her place truly had, and how readily her world, and the worlds that came after, reached for the easy verdict of blaming her. What clings to her name may be the truth or may be malice, but either way it tells us more about the cruelty of that judgment than about the girl who suffered it. She returned to England around the year 1519, a young woman now polished by her years in France, accomplished in the arts of the court, and ready to take her place at home and to be wed, as the daughters of ambitious families were, to advance the interests of her house. And in the early part of the year 1520 a good match was made for her. She was wed to a young man named William Carey, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, a rising courtier of good family and good prospects, but well placed in the inner circle of the household. It was a respectable and advantageous union, exactly the kind of match a family like the Boleyns would arrange for a daughter, joining Mary to a man close to the king, with a promising future before him. And it was a mark of the match's standing and of the family's rising importance that the king himself, Henry VIII, attended the wedding, lending his presence to the joining of his courtier and the Boleyn daughter. It seemed a fine beginning, a good match to a good man with a bright future, and for a gentlewoman in her position it was as much as she could reasonably have hoped for. To understand the world Mary moved through in her years at home, you must understand the English court, for it was the dazzling and dangerous centre of the whole realm, and life within it was unlike anything we know today. The court of Henry VIII was not a fixed spot, but a vast travelling household, hundreds upon hundreds of people who moved with the king from palace to palace through the changing seasons. From Greenwich to Hampton Court to Whitehall to Windsor and back again, a vast and glittering caravan of nobles and servants and hangers-on. At its centre was the king himself, the sun around which everything revolved, and the whole purpose of the court was to be near him, to bask in his presence, to catch his eye and win his favour. For favour was the currency of that world, the source from which all advancement and all reward flowed. To be at court was to live in a perpetual competition for the king's attention, a competition conducted through display and charm and careful manoeuvre, in which the prizes were vast and the dangers were real. It was a sphere of extraordinary magnificence, and the splendour of it would dazzle our modern eyes. The palaces were hung with rich tapestries and cloth of gold. The great halls blazed with candlelight, the courtiers dressed in silks and velvets and furs, glittering with jewels dressed to be seen and to impress. There were feasts of astonishing abundance, and entertainments and masques and dancing, music and poetry and games, the whole apparatus of a Renaissance court devoted to pleasure and display. For a young woman like Mary, freshly returned from France with her courtly polish, this was the natural element, the life she had been trained for, a world of beauty and amusement and constant performance, where a clever and attractive young woman might shine. And shine she did for a time, attractive and accomplished and pleasing, exactly the kind of ornament that such a court prized. But beneath the glittering surface, the court was also a place of intense and often deadly competition, of faction and intrigue and ruthless ambition, where fortunes were made and broken, and where a single misstep could mean ruin. The favour that everyone competed for was given by a king whose moods were unpredictable, and whose displeasure could be catastrophic, and the higher one rose in his favour, the more one had to lose. The court was riven by factions, by competing families and interests, all jockeying for advantage, all watching one another for weakness, all ready to profit from a rival's fall. It was a court that rewarded cunning and punished naivety, that demanded constant vigilance and careful calculation, where trust was dangerous and where even the highest could be brought low in an instant. The whole tragedy of the Boleyns would be played out in this world, the dazzling rise and the annihilating fall, and she saw it all, saw what the pursuit of favour and grandeur led to, and drew in the end her own conclusions. For women, the court was a peculiar arena, offering its own opportunities and its own dangers. A woman could not hold office or wield power in her own right, but she could rise through marriage and through the favour she won, and above all through the men whose attention she attracted. The great prize for an ambitious family was to place a daughter where she might catch the eye of a powerful man, even of the king himself, and the women of the court were watched and judged and valued largely for their beauty and their charm and their marriageability. It was an order that used women as instruments, as ornaments and assets and pawns in the schemes of men, and that offered them little security and less protection. A woman who caught the king's eye might rise, but she might also be used and discarded, her reputation spent, her value diminished. This was the court Mary entered, one that would use her as it used all its women, and the wonder of her story is that she found, in the end, a way to step out of it, to refuse its values and its games, and to make for herself a life on her own terms. But not long after her marriage, Mary's life took the turn that would define her forever, for she caught the eye of the king. Henry VIII in these years was, in the prime of his life, a magnificent figure, tall and athletic and handsome, charming and cultured and adored, the very image of a Renaissance prince, and like many a prince of his age, he kept mistresses alongside his queen, discreetly, as was the custom of kings. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon was still outwardly secure, but Catherine was some years older than the king and worn by many pregnancies, and Henry's eye wandered, as kings' eyes did, toward the young and beautiful women of his court. And it came to rest for a time upon Mary Boleyn, the attractive young wife of his courtier, William Carey, freshly returned from France with her courtly polish and her faint air of worldly experience. And so she became what her family could never openly acknowledge but surely understood, and perhaps even welcomed, the mistress of the king. The affair between Mary and Henry was a discreet and private thing, conducted discreetly, as such royal affairs were, behind the scenes of the court, and we know remarkably little about it, for it was never paraded or proclaimed. Unlike the public drama that would later surround her sister Anne, Mary's time as the king's mistress left almost no mark on the official records, no letters, no proclamations, no scandal openly acknowledged. It was simply understood, in the discreet way that such things were understood at court, that the king had taken a fancy to Mistress Carey, and that her complacent husband, who could hardly object to such attentions to his wife, was suitably rewarded with grants and offices and royal favour. This was the way of things in that age for a man whose wife drew the king's eye. There was no question of refusal, no possibility of objection. The king's desire was a kind of command, and a clever courtier made the best of it, accepting the favours and the advancement that came with his wife's royal connection, and asking no awkward questions. At the centre of Mary's story, as at the centre of the whole age, stands the figure of Henry VIII, the king whose desires shaped and reshaped the lives of everyone around him, and it is worth looking closely at the man, for he was the central force that moved through Mary's life and her family's destiny. The Henry she knew, in the years when she caught his eye, was not yet the bloated and terrifying tyrant of his later years, but a king in the splendour of his youth and prime. He had come to the throne as a young man of 18, golden and gifted and adored, and in the years that followed he had dazzled his kingdom and all of Europe. He was tall and powerfully built, athletic and energetic, a champion at the joust and the hunt, tireless in his pursuit of pleasure and glory. He was cultured and learned, a musician and a scholar, fluent in languages, a patron of the arts. He was charming and charismatic, capable of great warmth and great generosity, the very image of the magnificent Renaissance prince. To be favoured by such a king, to bask in the warmth of his attention, must have been intoxicating, and it is no wonder that the women of his court and their families competed for his notice. But beneath the golden surface, even in those early years, there ran the qualities that would later turn so dark, the boundless self-regard, the conviction that his own desires were the measure of all things, the dangerous capacity to believe that whatever he wanted was right, and just simply because he wanted it. Henry was a man accustomed from birth to having his way, to being the centre of every room and the master of every situation, and this bred in him a self-absorption so complete that he could convince himself of almost anything, or could persuade himself that his desires were the will of God, and his whims were matters of high principle. We see this in the way he took his mistresses, as a natural right, expecting the women and their families to accommodate his pleasure without question. We see it, more darkly, in the way he would later cast aside and destroy those who had served his desires when they ceased to please him. The king who took Mary up and set her down, who took up her sister and then destroyed her, was a man for whom other people, and especially women, were instruments of his own will, to be used while they pleased him, and discarded or destroyed when they did not. For the women caught in the orbit of such a king, the experience was one of dazzling opportunity and mortal danger combined, and the fate of the Boleyn sisters shows both faces of it. To catch the king's eye was to be lifted up, showered with favour, brought close to the dazzling centre of power, and for an ambitious family it was the highest prize. But it was also to be placed at the mercy of a man whose favour was utterly unreliable, whose desire could turn to indifference or even to deadly hatred without warning, and who acknowledged no obligation to those he had used. She experienced the gentler face of this, taken up and quietly set aside, used and discarded but left alive and more or less unharmed. Her sister Anne experienced the terrible face of it, raised to the very throne and then destroyed when his desire curdled. Her life the price of his changeable heart. The same king, the same fickle and self-absorbed will, lifted one sister to a crown and the other to his bed, and then cast both aside, the one into death and the other into a disgrace that proved by the strangest of mercies to be her salvation. Understanding Henry helps us understand the wisdom of Mary's eventual choice, for in turning away from the age of the court, the sphere of royal favour, she was turning away from the most dangerous force in her whole age, which was dependence on the will of Henry VIII. As long as a person's fortunes rested on the favour of the crown, they were at the mercy of the most unreliable and dangerous force in the realm, the changeable desires of a self-absorbed and increasingly ruthless man. Mary's family staked everything on that favour, lived and died by it, rose to glory and fell to ruin on the turning of his heart. And Mary, in marrying her obscure soldier and retreating into the countryside, removed herself from that dependence, placed herself beyond the reach of his fickle will, founded her life not on the favour of a dangerous man, but on the love of a faithful one. It was, though she may not have framed it so, the wisest possible response to the central danger of her age, the danger of the king, and it saved her where her family's pursuit of royal favour destroyed them. We should pause to consider what it actually meant to be the mistress of a king in Mary's age, for it is easy to misunderstand across the distance of 5 centuries, and the reality was a particular and a complicated thing. In the courts of Renaissance Europe, it was simply expected that a king would have mistresses, that alongside his queen, whom he married for reasons of state and dynasty, he would take his pleasure where he pleased among the women of his court. This was not regarded as a great scandal, not openly at least, but as one of the ordinary prerogatives of kingship, a matter that everyone knew about and no one openly challenged. A king's desire was a kind of force of nature, or a kind of command, and the women on whom it fell, and their families were expected to accommodate it, to make the best of it, even to profit from it. To be chosen by the king was, in the cold logic of the court, a kind of opportunity, a source of favour and advancement for a woman's whole family. For the woman herself, the role of royal mistress was a strange and precarious one, offering real rewards but no security at all. While the king's favour lasted, a mistress and her family might receive grants and offices and advancement, might rise in wealth and standing on the strength of the royal connection. But the favour could end at any moment, for a king's desire was a fickle thing, and when it faded, the mistress was simply set aside, with no claim, no protection, no recourse. She might be married off, or pensioned, or simply forgotten, and her value, having been spent, was gone. It was a role that used a woman and then discarded her, that traded her youth and beauty for a temporary advancement that abandoned her when it was over, diminished and exposed. And it carried, too, a lasting cost to her reputation, for however much the world accepted that kings took mistresses, the women who filled that role were marked by it, their names tainted, their honour compromised in the eyes of an age that judged women's virtue harshly. Mary's experience of the role seems to have been a muted and undramatic version of it, for she was, by every sign, a complacent and undemanding mistress, content to take what came and to make no trouble. She did not, like some who held that station, use her position to wield influence or amass riches or play the games of court politics. She did not, as her sister later would, refuse the king's bed and hold out for the crown. She simply received his attentions while they lasted, and received their ending when they ended, slipping softly into and out of the role without drama or demand. This reticence has left her thinly recorded, for she made no mark, stirred no scandal, left no trace to speak of. But it tells us something of her character, of a kind of acceptance, even a passivity, that ran through her early life. The daughter trained to be used by her family and her king, taking her appointed lot, asking for nothing, making the best of what came. And yet, when we set Mary's time as the king's mistress against what came after, against the bold and defiant step she would take in marrying William Stafford for love, we can see her whole life as a journey from passivity to agency, from being used to choosing for herself. In her early years, she was acted upon, positioned and wed and taken up and set aside by the men and the kin who controlled her, a passive instrument of others' purposes. She was sent to France, given to Carey, taken by the king, discarded, all by the decisions of others. But somewhere within her, through all of it, there grew a different woman, one who would at last decide entirely for herself, in defiance of everyone, for no reason but her own heart. The mistress who had taken her lot and asked for nothing became in the end the woman who threw it all away for love, and declared that she would rather beg her bread with the man she loved than be the greatest queen in Christendom. It is one of the gentle wonders of her tale, this growth from passive instrument to defiant chooser, and it makes her, for all her obscurity, one of the more genuinely admirable figures of her glittering and brutal age. How long the affair lasted and how deep it ran we cannot say with any certainty, for the discretion that surrounded it has kept its secrets for 500 years. It seems to have run for some few years in the early to middle 1520s, a quiet and intermittent thing, but the king turning to her when it pleased him, and turning away when it did not. There was no grand passion in it, as far as we can tell, nothing like the consuming obsession that would later seize Henry over Anne. She was a pleasant diversion, a comfortable and undemanding mistress, and when he tired of her, as kings tired of their mistresses, the affair simply faded away, without drama, without rupture. She was not the kind of woman to make difficulties, to demand or to cling. She accepted her place and accepted its ending, and slipped back into the ordinary life of a courtier's wife, the brief time in the king's bed leaving her, it seemed, with little more than the memories and whatever advancement it had brought her husband and her family. But it may have left her with something more lasting than that, for during the years of her marriage to William Carey and the years of her affair with the king, she bore 2 children, and the question of who fathered them has echoed down the centuries. She bore 2 children during her marriage to William Carey, a daughter named Catherine and a son named Henry, and from that day to this, people have wondered whether one or both of them were in truth the children not of William Carey but of the king. The timing is suggestive, for the children were born in the very years when she was the king's mistress, and the son was even named Henry, though that was a common enough name and proves nothing. But here is the telling fact, the thing that sets her children apart from the king's second natural child. Henry VIII had one illegitimate son, whom he openly acknowledged and honoured, a boy named Henry Fitzroy, born to another mistress, whom the king loaded with titles and treated almost as a prince. He never acknowledged them at all. Whatever the truth of their paternity, the king made no claim upon them, gave them no titles, owned them in no way, and this silence has been read both ways down the centuries, by some as proof that they were not his, by others as proof of nothing more than the discretion that surrounded the whole affair. The honest answer is that we do not know, and almost certainly never will, whether the royal strain ran in her children or not. What we do know is far more remarkable, and we shall come to it at the very end, for whatever Henry VIII chose to acknowledge, the descendants of Mary Boleyn would rise to a height that none of them could have dreamed. Mary's 2 children, Catherine and Henry Carey, deserve their own place in her story, for they were the fruit of her early life and the channel of her enduring legacy, and their fortunes are a part of her own. When their father was carried off by the sweating sickness, they were left small and vulnerable, the children of a widowed and impoverished mother, their futures clouded and uncertain. It would have been easy, in that precarious season, to imagine them sinking into the obscurity that had swallowed their mother, 2 more well-born children with no fortune and no clear place in the world. But that is not what happened to them. Both, in their different ways, would rise, and one of them would rise to a height that touched the very crown, though neither could have guessed it in those anxious early years. It was the boy, Henry Carey, whose early care became a matter of family concern, for after his father's death, his wardship was taken up by his aunt, the ascendant Anne, who arranged for his education and his upbringing, ensuring that the boy was properly raised and schooled despite his mother's reduced circumstances. So Henry Carey was brought up under the wing of his powerful aunt, given the education befitting a young gentleman, prepared for a position in the world, and he made good use of it, growing into a capable and able man who would rise in the reign of his cousin Elizabeth to become a figure of real importance, ennobled and trusted, the founder of a noble line. The son of the forgotten sister ascended to honour and consequence, served his royal cousin faithfully, and founded a family that would endure among the nobility of England for centuries. The daughter, Catherine Carey, would prove the more remarkable of the two, though that part of the story belongs to a later chapter, when we follow Mary's blood down the long years to its astonishing destination. For the present, it is enough to say that Catherine made a good marriage and bore a large family, and that she would one day stand close to the very heart of the kingdom. The children of the forgotten sister did not vanish with their mother into obscurity. They went out into the world and made their mark upon it, and that quiet woman who had wanted nothing for herself proved, through them, to have given a great deal to the future. By the middle years of the 1520s, the royal interest in her had faded, and the affair quietly ended, as such affairs did, leaving her to settle back into the life of a courtier's wife and mother. And it was at just this moment, as Mary's star dimmed, that another star began to rise in its place, and it was a star that bore the same name as her own. For the king's restless eye, having tired of the elder Boleyn sister, now fell upon the younger, upon Anne, who had returned from her own years in France and taken her spot at the English court, and who was, by every account, a creature of dazzling and dangerous charm. And here her life takes the turn that would shape everything, for where she had been a comfortable and complacent mistress, content to take what came and ask for nothing, Anne was something altogether different, ambitious and clever and proud, and she would not be a mistress at all. She would hold the king off, refuse to yield, play upon his desire until it became an obsession, and aim not at the king's bed but at his crown. Imagine, if you can, what this must have been for her, to watch her younger sister climb, on the very same royal favour that had once been hers, to a height she herself had never approached. She had been the king's mistress, and had faded softly from his attention. Now Anne took up that same royal interest, and turned it into something vast and history-changing, refusing to be a passing fancy, demanding all, reaching for the throne itself. The one who had come first in everything, who had gone to France first and to the king first, now found herself wholly eclipsed and overtaken, while her junior became the most talked-about woman in Europe, the cause for which a king would break with the Pope and tear his realm apart. There is something painful in the thought of her in those years, the discarded sister watching the other ascend, and we can only guess at what she felt, whether for envy or relief, bitterness or a kind of dawning wisdom. But whatever it was, her own moment had passed, and she had become, in the drama of the Boleyn ascent, a minor figure, a footnote, the one who had been there first and been forgotten. The rise of Anne Boleyn is one of the most extraordinary stories of the age, and since it forms the backdrop to the eclipse of her elder sister, it is worth telling in fuller measure, for it shows us exactly what she was set against, and why she was so completely overshadowed. Anne returned from her own years in France not long after her sister, and like her she had been polished and finished by the French court, made elegant and accomplished and worldly. But Anne was a very different creature from her elder sister, and the difference would change the course of history. Where the elder was pliant and accepting, Anne was sharp and proud and ambitious. Where she had a soft and yielding beauty, Anne had a darker, more striking, more compelling kind of attraction, not conventionally beautiful by the standards of her age, but magnetic, witty, stylish, with dark eyes and a quick tongue and an air of sophisticated allure that drew men to her irresistibly. She was a performer, a personality, a woman who knew how to fascinate, and when she set herself to captivate the court, she succeeded brilliantly. The relationship between the two Boleyn sisters, Mary and Anne, is one of the most intriguing and least knowable aspects of the whole story, and it is worth dwelling on, for these two women, so close in blood and so different in fate, were bound together in ways both tender and cruel. They were sisters, raised together in the same household, sent both to France to be finished, both drawn into the orbit of the same king, their lives entangled at every turn. And yet they could hardly have been more different in temperament and in destiny, the one soft and yielding and accepting, the other sharp and proud and ambitious, the one discarded and forgotten, the other crowned and destroyed. We can only guess at the feelings that ran between them, at the mixture of love and rivalry, of closeness and resentment, that must have marked the bond of two sisters whose fortunes were so strangely intertwined. There must have been love between them, or at least the deep familiarity of sisters raised together, and there are signs of it in the record, for when she was widowed and left in difficulty, it was Anne who came to her aid, securing the wardship of Mary's son and arranging some support for her struggling sister. That was an act of kindness, or at least of family duty, the powerful sister helping the fallen one. And yet it was also an act that confirmed a reversal between them, that made her a dependent of Anne, the elder sister beholden to the younger, the discarded one living on the charity of the ascendant one. Whatever love there was between them was complicated by this profound inequality of fortune, by the fact that Anne had risen so far past she, had taken the king's favour that had once been Mary's and turned it into a crown. It is hard to imagine that there was not, on Mary's side, some current of complicated feeling, some mixture of gratitude and resentment, of love for her sister, and pain at her own eclipse. And then came the rupture, the breach that the secret marriage caused, for when she married William Stafford against the family's wishes, it was her sister, the Queen, who was most furious, most unforgiving, who drove the banishment to cast Mary out. Here the relationship turned from complicated love to open conflict, the Queen enraged at her sister's disgraceful match, Mary defiant in her love. The two sisters set against each other over the question that divided them most deeply, the question of whether grandeur or love should rule a life. Anne, who had staked everything on grandeur, could not forgive her for choosing love, for throwing away the family's dignity at the very moment of its greatest glory. And Mary, who had chosen love, would not repent of it to satisfy her sister's pride. The breach was real, and it was never healed, for within 2 years Anne was dead, and whatever might have passed between the sisters in the end, whatever reconciliation might have come with time, was cut off forever by the executioner's sword. If she was indeed the firstborn, as most now believe, then the natural order was inverted between them, the younger climbing past the one who by birth should have led, eclipsing her and at last driving her into banishment. There is something especially sharp in that reversal, the senior overtaken by the junior, and it may have deepened whatever rivalry simmered beneath their bond. Yet the plainest truth of their kinship may be the saddest, that here were two women raised together who came, through ambition and fortune and the deadly games of the court, to be set against each other, their closeness worn away by the very forces that had once lifted them both. When the king's eye fell upon Anne, as it had once fallen upon her sister, Anne did the thing that changed everything, the thing that no one expected and that altered the whole course of English history. She refused him. Where she had yielded, had been a complacent mistress and been discarded, Anne would not yield. She held the king off, refused to become merely another mistress to be used and set aside, and in doing so she inflamed his desire into something unprecedented, a consuming obsession that would not be denied. The more Anne refused, the more Henry wanted her, until his want became the driving force of his life, the cause for which he would do anything, sacrifice anything, change anything. Anne played this dangerous game with extraordinary nerve and skill, holding out year after year, neither yielding nor quite refusing, keeping the king in a fever of frustrated desire, until at last he resolved upon the thing that would shake Christendom, to put aside his queen of 20 years and make Anne his wife. What followed was the great crisis that we call the King's Great Matter, the long and tortuous struggle by which Henry sought to free himself from Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, a struggle that consumed years and that ended by tearing England out of the Catholic Church and remaking the religious life of the kingdom. For the king could not simply set aside his queen, the Pope would not grant him the annulment he demanded, and Catherine fought her demotion with unbending courage. The struggle dragged on for years, dividing the court and the country, and in the end Henry resolved it by the most drastic of means, by breaking with Rome altogether, declaring himself the head of the Church in England, and granting himself the annulment that the Pope had refused. It was a revolution, one of the great turning points of English history, and it was all set in motion by his obsession with Anne Boleyn, Mary's younger sister. In 1533, Anne became Queen of England, crowned in high splendour, carrying the king's child at the very summit of a rise more dazzling than any of her family could have dreamed. It is worth pausing, as we follow Mary's small and human path, to lift our eyes to the sheer scale of what her family had set in motion, for the consequences ran on long after the Boleyns themselves were dust. We have seen how the king's longing for Anne led him to break the ancient bond with Rome, but that rupture was only the beginning. From it flowed a transformation that reached into every parish and every household in the land, touching the faith and the daily life of people who had never heard the name of Boleyn and never would. The consequences of this were staggering, far beyond anything that could have been foreseen when a king first cast his eye upon a dark-eyed young woman of his court. The break with Rome led on to the dissolution of the monasteries, the destruction of the venerable religious houses that had dotted the English landscape for centuries, the seizure of their vast wealth and lands by the crown. It led on to the slow transformation of English religion, the coming of Protestant ideas, the upheaval of the old faith that had shaped English life for 1,000 years. It led to division and conflict and persecution, to the burning of those who clung too closely to the old ways, or pressed too far toward the new, to a religious turmoil that would convulse the kingdom for generations. And all of it flowed, in the first instance, from his desire for Anne Boleyn, from the obsession that drove him to remake his kingdom rather than be denied the woman he wanted. There is something almost vertiginous in the thought that so vast a transformation should have sprung from so personal a source, that the whole religious life of a kingdom should have been overturned because a king desired a particular woman. It reminds us how, in an age of personal monarchy, the private passions of the powerful could reshape the lives of millions, how the longing of one man for one woman could break a kingdom's faith and remake its soul. The Boleyns were at the centre of this, the family whose daughter was the occasion of it all, and they rose to their dizzy height on the strength of his world-changing passion. But they were also, in a sense, its victims, for the same passion that raised them destroyed them when it turned, and the religious revolution they had helped to trigger rolled on long after they were gone, indifferent to the family that had been its accidental cause. And Mary, the quiet sister, was bound up in all of this, and yet apart from it, present at the heart of the family that triggered the Reformation and yet untouched, in the end, by the forces it unleashed. She was there through the years of the king's great matter, swept up in the Boleyn ascendancy that the king's desire created. But she took no real part in the religious drama, left no mark on the theological struggles of the age, and when she made her own decisive choice, it was not for any cause or principle or faith, but simply for love. There is something fitting in this, that she should stand a little apart from the vast impersonal forces that consumed her age, the religious upheavals and the dynastic struggles and the weighty matters of state. Hers was a human tale of love and survival and hard-won wisdom, played out against the backdrop of those events, but not really of them. While her family rode and fell with the tides of the age, she lived a smaller and more human life, and it was precisely her smallness, her retreat from the wide stage, that saved her. The Reformation rolled on, the dynastic dramas played out, and Mary, apart from it all, loved her soldier and raised her children and lived in peace. And here perhaps lies the most interesting thing about Mary in these years of her family's triumph, which is what she may have understood that the rest of them could not. For of all the Boleyns, drunk on their dizzy ascent, she alone had already stood where Anne now stood, in the warmth of the king's affection, and she alone had felt that warmth withdraw. She knew from the inside how fickle that favour was, how swiftly it could cool, how little it finally guaranteed. So while her father and her brother and her sister built ever higher on the strength of the king's desire, Mary, watching from the edge, may have felt a quiet disquiet that none of them shared, a sense that a structure raised on so shifting a ground could not stand. There may have been pride in her too, and profit, for she shared in the family's elevation. But threaded through it, one suspects, was the unease of the one person who had already been lifted up by that desire, and then set gently down, and who therefore knew, as the others did not, that what rises on a king's wanting can fall the moment the wanting stops. And then, in the year 1528, Mary's situation grew suddenly worse, for her husband William Carey died, struck down in the prime of his life by the sweating sickness, the terrible epidemic disease that swept through England that year and killed its victims with horrifying speed. She was left a widow, and not a wealthy one, for Carey's death left her with debts and with 2 young children to raise and little to raise them on. She was suddenly vulnerable, dependent, a widow of reduced means in a world that offered few protections to such women. And the cruel irony was that the rescue, such as it was, came from the sister who had eclipsed her, for Anne, now the king's all-powerful favourite, used her influence to secure some relief for her widowed sister, taking the wardship of the boy into her own hands and arranging for the boy's education, and prevailing upon the king to grant Mary some small support. It was help of a kind, but it was help that confirmed Mary's fall, for it made her a dependent of her younger sister, a poor relation living on the charity of the woman who had surpassed her, the discarded elder sister reduced to gratitude toward the ascendant younger one. She had fallen about as low as a Boleyn could fall, and worse was still to come. The disease that killed Mary's husband and changed her fortunes deserves a closer look, for the sweating sickness was one of the great terrors of the Tudor age, a mysterious and merciless killer that has never been fully explained, and it shaped the lives of everyone who remained through those years. The sweating sickness was unlike the other great epidemic diseases of the age, unlike the plague that everyone knew and dreaded. It appeared suddenly, struck with terrifying speed, and killed, in many cases, within a single day. A person might be well in the morning and dead by nightfall, carried off by a violent fever and a drenching sweat that gave the disease its name. It struck seemingly at random, falling upon the young and strong, as readily as the old and weak, and it had a particular and frightening tendency to strike the prosperous and the well-fed, the very people who imagined themselves safest. It came in waves, sweeping through the country every few years, and each time it came it brought terror with it, for no one understood its cause and no one knew how to escape it. The outbreak of the year 1528, the one that killed William Carey, was among the worst of these visitations, and it threw the whole court and the whole country into a panic. The king himself, Henry VIII, was terrified of the disease, for all his robust health and his courage in other things, and he fled from it, moving constantly from house to house to escape the contagion, scattering his court, avoiding crowds, dosing himself with remedies. The sickness respected no rank, and it carried off people close to the king, struck down members of his own household, and threatened, for a time, even the highest of the realm. It was in this terrifying season, with the disease raging through the country and the courts scattered in fear, that William Carey was struck down and died, swiftly, as the sweating sickness killed, leaving Mary a widow in the midst of the general terror. For Mary, the loss of her husband in that dreadful summer was a personal catastrophe that went beyond grief, for it left her suddenly exposed and vulnerable in a realm that offered little to a widow of modest means. William Carey had been her protection and her provision, a rising courtier whose position and income had supported her and her children. With his death, all of that was gone. She was left with 2 young children to raise, with debts to pay, and with no clear means of support, dependent now on the goodwill of her family and the charity of others. In an age that offered women few ways to provide for themselves, the death of a husband could plunge a woman from comfort into precarity in a single stroke, and this is what happened to Mary, cast down by the sweating sickness from the settled life of a courtier's wife into the uncertain existence of a poor widow. It was the beginning of the low and dependent years that would eventually drive her to the desperate and glorious choice of marrying for love. There is something fitting, in a grim way, that disease should play so large a part in Mary's story, for it reminds us of the precariousness of all life in that age, the constant nearness of mortality that shadowed even the grandest and most fortunate. The Tudors lived always in the presence of sudden death, from disease, from childbirth, from the violence of the state, and no amount of wealth or position could buy real security against it. The sweating sickness that killed William Carey was a force entirely beyond human control, striking where it would, and its blow to she was as random and as undeserved as such blows always are. And yet, in the strange working out of her story, even this catastrophe served in the end to push her toward the choice that saved her, for it was her widowhood and her vulnerability that eventually led her to William Stafford and to the love match that took her out of the deadly orbit of the court. The disease that seemed to ruin her was one more step on the road that led, by paths no one could have foreseen, to her survival. There is a stretch of Mary's life that we have passed over quickly, but that deserves a closer look. The years when her sister was queen and she lived on the edge of that dazzling court, a widow and a poor relation in the household of the most powerful woman in England. After the death of William Carey in the sweating sickness, and before her own great choice to marry William Stafford, she spent some years in this strange and difficult position, attached to her sister's establishment, dependent on Anne's favour, present at the height of the Boleyn glory, yet diminished within it, a faded figure at the edge of her sister's triumph. It is a period we know little about, but we can imagine its texture, and it tells us much about the world Mary inhabited and the pressures that shaped her eventual flight from it. To be the Queen's sister sounds a grand thing, and in some ways it was, for Mary shared, however modestly, in the family's elevation, lived close to the centre of power, was lifted by the Boleyn ascendancy, along with all her kin. But her place was also painful and precarious, for she was a poor widow living on charity, a discarded former mistress overshadowed by the sister who had succeeded where she had failed, a dependent in a household where she had once been an equal or more. Every day she would have seen her younger sister in the full glory of her queenship, surrounded by deference and splendour, while she herself lived as a poor relation, grateful for what crumbs of support came her way. It must have been a galling position for a proud woman, this constant reminder of her own eclipse, this daily spectacle of her sister's triumph, set against her own diminishment, and it may have done much to sour her on the whole world of the court and its glories. The court in those years of Anne's queenship was a place of particular tension and danger, for Anne was a controversial and much hated queen, resented by many, surrounded by enemies, her standing resting entirely on the king's favour, and on her ability to give him the son he craved. The atmosphere around her was charged with intrigue and hostility, with the constant manoeuvring of factions, the watching and waiting of enemies, the gathering of those who hoped for her fall. To live in that atmosphere, close to the embattled queen, must have been wearing and frightening, a constant exposure to the dangers and tensions of a court, where the stakes were life and death, and where the queen's position grew, with every passing month that failed to bring a son, more precarious. Mary, living on the edge of all this, would have felt the danger in the air, would have seen the gathering storm, and it may have sharpened her desire to be gone, to escape the deadly court of the court, for somewhere safer and quieter. It is in this context that we should understand Mary's flight into marriage with William Stafford, for it was not only a flight toward love, but a flight away from the court, away from the painful position of poor relation, and the gathering danger of her sister's embattled queenship. When she married her soldier and was banished, she escaped not only into love, but out of a court that had become for her a place of humiliation and growing peril. She left the court where she lived as a diminished dependent, fled the dangerous atmosphere around her embattled sister, left the whole glittering and treacherous court that had used her and discarded her, and now kept her as a poor relation on the edge of its glory. Her banishment, which seemed a disaster, was in truth an escape, a flight to safety and love away from a station that offered her nothing but humiliation and danger. And when the catastrophe came 2 years later and engulfed it all, she was well out of reach, safe in the retirement she had fled to, while the court she had left destroyed itself in blood. But it was out of this low and dependent place, this state of widowed obscurity in the shadow of her sister's glory, that she did the one act that lifts her whole story out of sadness and makes it, in the end, something fine. For Mary Boleyn fell in love. Sometime in the early 1530s, this widowed daughter of an ambitious house, this discarded former mistress of a king, met a man named William Stafford, and she loved him, and he loved her, and she made up her mind to marry him. Now William Stafford was not at all the kind of husband that a Boleyn was supposed to take. He was a soldier, a man of relatively modest rank and modest means, a second son without great prospects, far beneath the station that a daughter of the Boleyns, sister to the woman who was about to become Queen of England, was expected to marry. To wed such a man was to throw away every advantage of her birth and her connection, to marry not for advancement but for love, to please her own heart rather than her family's ambition. It was, by the cold calculations of her sphere, an act of folly, even of madness. And she did it anyway. The man for whom she threw away her place in the world deserves to be known, for William Stafford was the great love of her life and the agent of her salvation, and though history has left him in shadow, he was clearly a man worth loving. He was a soldier, a younger son of a gentry family, serving in the English garrison at Calais, that last outpost of English power on the soil of France, where Mary may first have encountered him during one of the court's visits across the Channel. He was not a great man, not a rich or powerful or well-connected one, but a man of modest rank and modest means, making his way in the world through service, as younger sons had to do. By the calculations of Mary's family, he was nobody, a match far beneath the dignity of a Boleyn, sister to the Queen of England. But he seems to have been a good man, brave and steady and true, and Mary loved him, and that, in the end, was all that mattered to her. We know little of how their love began, for it was conducted in the shadows, away from the eyes of a court that would never have approved it. But we can imagine something of it, the widowed Mary, lonely and vulnerable and diminished, dependent on the charity of a family that valued her little, finding in this honest soldier a warmth and a constancy and a genuine affection that her glittering and calculating age had never offered her. Here was a man who wanted her not for her connections or her royal associations, which were more liability than asset by then, but for herself, who offered her not advancement but love, not grandeur but partnership. For a woman who had spent her whole life being used as an instrument of others' purposes, placed and married and taken up and set aside, the experience of being simply loved, wanted for herself, must have been a revelation, and we can understand why she clung to it, why she was willing to sacrifice everything for it. Let me take you for a while to the position where Mary may first have met the man she would give up everything to marry, for the sphere of William Stafford was the world of Calais, the last English foothold on the continent of Europe, and it is a corner of the Tudor world worth knowing. Calais, on the northern coast of France, had been in English hands for nearly 2 centuries, the last remnant of the once vast English possessions in France, a walled town and its surrounding territory held as a precious outpost, a gateway between England and the continent, a garrison town guarding England's interest across the narrow sea. It was a place of soldiers and merchants and officials, an English town on foreign soil, with its garrison and its fortifications, its wool trade, and its constant traffic of travellers passing between the kingdom and the wider court. The court visited Calais on its journeys to and from the continent, and it was a posting for soldiers and administrators in the king's service, men like William Stafford, serving in the garrison that held this last English fragment of France. It was a hard and unglamorous kind of service, the life of the Calais garrison, far from the splendour of the court, a matter of guard duty and drill, and the endless watchfulness of a frontier post. The men who served there were not the glittering courtiers of the king's privy chamber, but working soldiers and officials, doing the unglamorous work of holding a frontier, men of modest rank and modest means, making their way through service. William Stafford was such a man, a younger son without great prospects, serving in the garrison, earning his living and his advancement through the hard and humble work of a soldier. He was not a man of the court, not a player in the great games of favour and faction, but a man of action and service, reliable and brave, the kind of man who held the frontiers and did the necessary work while the courtiers preened and schemed in the palaces at home. It was perhaps during one of the court's visits to Calais, or during Mary's own travels, that she encountered this honest soldier, and we can imagine something of what drew her to him. She had spent her life among the courtiers, the polished and calculating men of the king's circle, men who valued her for her connections and her royal associations, men of charm and ambition and little constancy. And here, in William Stafford, she found something different, a man of plainer stuff, loyal and true, a man who offered not the glittering and treacherous favour of the court, but the simple constancy of genuine affection. After the king who had used her and set her aside, after the courtiers who valued her for her connections, after a lifetime among the calculating and the ambitious, the faithful devotion of an honest soldier must have seemed to Mary like solid ground after years at sea, something real and lasting to hold to in a world of shifting favour and treacherous calculation. There is a fittingness in the fact that Mary's salvation came from outside the world of the court, from a man of the frontier and the garrison rather than the palace and the privy chamber. The court had been the scene of all Mary's troubles, the place where she was used and discarded, where her family rose and fell, where the deadly games were played that destroyed her kin, and her escape from it came in the form of a man who belonged to a different realm, the humbler and more honest sphere of service and duty, far from the glittering centre of power. In choosing William Stafford, she was not merely choosing a particular man, but choosing an entirely different way of life, turning from the court to the country, from grandeur to obscurity, From the treacherous favour of kings to the steady love of an honest man. It was the choice that saved her, and it came, fittingly, from the edges of her world, from the frontier and the garrison, from the plain and honest places, far from the deadly centre where the great ones rose and fell. For sacrifice everything she did, and the magnitude of the sacrifice tells us how much the love meant to her. To marry William Stafford was to throw away every advantage of her birth and her position, to forfeit the favour of her powerful family, to enrage her royal sister, to accept disgrace and banishment and poverty. It was by every worldly measure a catastrophic step, the deliberate destruction of her own prospects for the sake of love, and she made it with open eyes, knowing exactly what it would cost, and she never repented of it. This was the woman who had been the passive instrument of others all her life, who had been sent and married and used at the will of her family and her king, and who now, for the first time and at the greatest cost, decided entirely for herself, for no reason but love. There is a kind of magnificence in it, a quiet heroism, that this overlooked and undervalued woman should have found, in the depths of her diminishment, the courage to seize the one prize she truly wanted, and to hold to it against the fury of the whole world. And the choice she made speaks to something that ran beneath the whole glittering surface of her age, a tension at the very centre of Tudor marriage and Tudor life, between the cold calculations of advancement and the warm claims of the human heart. In Mary's sphere, among the proud and the ambitious, marriage was a matter of property and alliance and advancement, a transaction between families in which love was an irrelevance and often an embarrassment. Daughters were bestowed where their family's interests dictated, and to marry for love, against the family's interest, was an act of folly and rebellion. But the human heart does not always submit to such calculations, and beneath the surface of every age there runs the old, stubborn, repressible human longing for love freely given and freely returned. Mary Boleyn, of all people, the discarded mistress, the instrument of her family's ambition, became an unlikely champion of that longing, choosing love over every worldly advantage, declaring that she would rather be poor and loved than great and alone. In doing so, she struck a small, quiet blow for the human heart against the cold machinery of her age, and though it cost her everything in the short term, it gave her, in the end, the one thing her grand and ambitious family never found, which was happiness. To grasp just how transgressive Mary's love match truly was, we must understand how marriage worked among the great families of her age, for the institution she defied was one of the central pillars of her whole social world, and her defiance of it was a far more radical act than it might appear to us today. In the world of the Tudor nobility and gentry, it was not, as we tend to think of it now, a union of two people who loved each other and chose each other freely. It was rather an alliance between families, a transaction concerned with property and power and advancement, arranged by parents and guardians for the benefit of the house, in which the wishes and the feelings of the bride and groom were largely beside the point. A union joined not just two people, but two families, two estates, two sets of interests, and it was negotiated with all the care and calculation of a treaty between powers, with settlements and dowries and the weighing of advantage. Within this system, a daughter was an asset to be deployed for its benefit, wed where the match would do the most good for the house, to forge an alliance, to gain a connection, to advance its standing or its fortunes. Her own preferences were not consulted, her consent was assumed. Her duty was to marry as her family directed and to make the match a success through her conduct as a wife. To marry for love against the family's interest was not merely unusual, but a kind of betrayal, a placing of one's own desires above the good of the family, a squandering of the asset that one's marriageability represented. A daughter who did such an act was not romantically admired, as she might be today, but condemned as willful and disobedient and ungrateful, a betrayer of her kin and a disgrace to its name. This was the system, and these were the values that Mary defied when she married William Stafford for love, and she defied them at the worst possible moment, in the most provocative possible way, which made her transgression all the greater in the eyes of her family. For she took her unsuitable soldier at the very height of the Boleyn glory, when her sister was queen and the house stood among the foremost in the land, at the moment when an embarrassment could least be afforded and had the most to lose from a disgraceful match. To marry a nobody, a mere soldier of modest rank, at such a moment was to humiliate the family in its hour of triumph, to introduce a note of squalid scandal into the Boleyn ascendancy, to drag the family's dignity down just when the family rode highest. From their point of view, it was an act of almost unforgivable selfishness and folly, a betrayal of everything they had worked for, and their fury at Mary, and Anne's fury above all, is entirely understandable in the terms of their age. She had taken the one asset she had left, her marriageability as the Queen's sister, and thrown it away on a love match that brought the family nothing but embarrassment. But of course, from Mary's point of view, and from ours, the matter looks entirely different. For what her family saw as betrayal and folly, we may see as courage and wisdom and a kind of liberation. She had spent her whole life as an asset to be deployed, married once already for the family's good, used as a mistress for its advantage, valued only for her usefulness to the house. And now, at last, she refused to be used any longer, refused to let her union be one more bargain struck for the family, and claimed instead the right to marry for her own happiness, to choose love over advantage, to live for herself rather than for the house. It was a declaration of independence, a claiming of her own life, an assertion that she was a person with her own heart and her own right to happiness, not merely an asset to be deployed. And though it cost her everything in the short term, though her family condemned her and cast her out, it was in the long run the wisest and the bravest thing she ever did, the choice that saved her life and brought her the happiness that her dutiful and obedient and advantageously married sister never found. Sometime around the year 1534, when her sister Anne was Queen of England, and at the very summit of her power, Mary secretly wed William Stafford, for love, without the knowledge or consent of her kin or her queen. It was a runaway union, a thing of the heart, made in secret, precisely because she knew perfectly well that it would never be permitted if she asked, that her relations would forbid it, and her royal sister be furious, and for a time the secret held. But secrets of that kind cannot hold forever, and hers was given away by the surest of betrayers, for she became pregnant by her new husband, and a quickening child cannot be hidden. When it became known at court that the Queen's sister had secretly taken a nobody, a mere soldier far beneath her, and was carrying his child, the reaction was everything she had feared and worse. Her relations were furious, humiliated by what they saw as a disgraceful and degrading match, and the Queen was furious above all, enraged that her sister had stooped so far beneath the dignity of the house without permission, at the very moment when the Boleyns were riding highest and could least afford an embarrassment. So she was banished from court, cast out, cut off, sent away in disgrace, abandoned by the very kin whose ambition she had served, and then defied. It was at this lowest moment, banished and disgraced, and cut off from her kin, that Mary Boleyn spoke for once in her own voice. Stripped of everything, with no powerful friends left to her, she did what people in trouble at that court did, and reached out in writing to one who might help her. And in the course of that appeal, she set down a few sentences in defence of what she had done, sentences that have outlasted every grand pronouncement of her glittering family, and that we shall come to in a moment, for they are the heart of everything this evening has been moving toward. It is a strange and moving thing, that of all the Boleyns who left behind them so many words of state and ambition and intrigue, it should be the forgotten sister, in her disgrace, who left the words that still ring true across 500 years. We hear her in that letter as we hear her nowhere else, and what we hear is not a fool or a wanton, the things her age called her, but a woman of clear sight and steady heart who knew exactly what she had chosen and exactly what it was worth. The letter that she wrote in the depths of her disgrace is the one moment in her whole life when we hear her own voice clearly across the centuries, and it deserves to be dwelt upon, for it is the key to her whole character and the heart of her tale. After her secret marriage to William Stafford was discovered, after she was cast out and cut off and abandoned by her furious family, she found herself in genuine distress, without money, without support, without the protection of the powerful kin who had disowned her. In this extremity she turned, as people in trouble at court did, to Thomas Cromwell, the king's great minister, the man who managed the business of the realm, and through whom favours and mercies might be sought. She wrote to him, pleading for help in softening the royal anger, and her family's in securing some relief from her desperate situation. And in the course of that plea, she set down the words that have made her, for those who know her story, one of the most quietly admirable figures of her age. The man to whom she turned in her hour of need, Thomas Cromwell, was one of the most extraordinary figures of the age, and since it was to him that she wrote her famous letter, it is worth understanding who he was and the world of power he commanded. Cromwell was, like the Boleyns, a self-made man, but his rise was even more remarkable, for he had climbed from the very bottom of society, the son of a brewer and blacksmith of humble station, to become the most powerful man in England after the king himself. He had risen through sheer ability, through a formidable intelligence and a genius for administration and a tireless capacity for work, making himself indispensable first to Cardinal Wolsey, and then, after Wolsey's fall, to the king. By the time she wrote to him, Cromwell was the king's chief minister, the chief minister who managed the whole business of the realm, who engineered the break with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries, who held the threads of power in his capable and ruthless hands. It was natural that Mary should turn to Cromwell in her distress, for he was the man through whom favours were sought and mercies obtained, the chief fixer and manager of the court, but the channel through which a person in trouble might hope to reach the royal ear or soften the king's anger. People wrote to Cromwell constantly, begging his help, his intercession, his protection, for he had the power to make or break, to advance or destroy, and a word from him could change a person's fortunes. Mary's letter to him was one of thousands such, a plea from a person in difficulty to the man who might help, and it followed the established pattern of such appeals, the acknowledgment of fault, the plea for mercy, the request for intercession. What set Mary's letter apart was not its form but its spirit, the unrepentant defiance with which she defended her choice even as she begged for help, the luminous conviction that shines through the conventional language of supplication. Cromwell's own story, like that of the Boleyns, would end in sudden and bloody ruin, and it is worth remembering as part of the wider pattern of the age, the pattern that Mary alone among her family escaped. For all his power and all his ability, Cromwell too depended entirely on the favour of the king, and when that favour turned, as it always eventually did, he fell as suddenly and as completely as anyone. A few years after she wrote to him, Cromwell, the most powerful man in England, was arrested, condemned without trial by the very methods he had used against others, and beheaded, his fall as swift and as total as the Boleyns had been. He had risen higher than almost anyone, served the king more ably than almost anyone, and it availed him nothing in the end, for he had built his fortunes on the same unstable foundation as the family, on the favour of Henry VIII, and that foundation gave way beneath him, as it gave way beneath them all. There is a pattern here that runs through the whole age, and that gives Mary's gentle story its deeper meaning, for almost everyone who climbed high in the court of Henry VIII came at last to ruin. Wolsey climbed to be the foremost man in the kingdom and died in disgrace. The Boleyns rose to the throne itself and perished on the scaffold. Cromwell climbed to command the realm and died beneath the axe. The great and the ambitious, the men and women who played the game of power and favour and rose to its dizzy heights, came crashing down one after another, destroyed by the same fickle royal will that had raised them. And meanwhile Mary, who left the game, who walked away from the pursuit of favour and grandeur, who staked her life not on the king, but on a humble and faithful love, survived them all, lived quietly through the years that destroyed the great ones, and came at last to a peaceful end in her bed. Her story is the photographic negative of theirs, the simple life set against the brilliant deaths, and it carries, for those who can read it, the deepest lesson of that whole glittering and murderous age, that the safest spot in an age ruled by a dangerous king was as far from his favour as one could get. Mary's whole life, when we step back from it, is in large part a story about the lives of women in her age, about the narrow paths open to them, and the few choices they were allowed, and it is worth pausing to consider that wider world, for it throws her quiet rebellion into sharp relief. The women of Mary's class and time lived lives almost wholly defined and controlled by men, by their fathers and their husbands and their kings. A woman of the nobility or gentry had little say in the great decisions of her own life. She did not choose whom she would marry, for that was decided by her family according to the interests of the house. She could not own property freely, or hold office, or act independently in the world. Her value was reckoned largely in terms of her usefulness to the men around her, as a maker of alliances through marriage, as a bearer of heirs, as an ornament of the court, and her virtue and her reputation were guarded and judged with a harshness that men never faced. Within this narrow realm, a woman's fortunes rose and fell almost entirely on the decisions of others and the turns of a luck she could not control. Mary's own early life is a perfect illustration of this powerlessness. She was sent to France because her father arranged it. She was married to William Carey because a match was made for her. She became the king's mistress because the king desired her, and there was no possibility of refusal. She was set aside when he tired of her, with no say in the matter. At every turn in her early life she was acted upon, moved about the board like a piece in a game played by others, her wishes irrelevant, her consent assumed, her life directed by the men who controlled it. This was the common lot of women in her world, to be the objects of others' decisions, to have their lives shaped by forces they could not influence, to be used and valued and discarded according to purposes not their own. And this is exactly what makes Mary's decision so remarkable, what lifts it from a mere love affair into something close to an act of liberation. When she married William Stafford for love, against the will of her family and her queen, she did the one thing that the women of her world were almost never able to do. She chose for herself. She took the central decision of her life, the choosing of a husband, out of the hands of the men and the family who claimed the right to make it, and she made it herself, on her own authority, for her own reasons, in defiance of everyone. It was an assertion of her own will, her own right to direct her own life, that flew in the face of everything her sphere believed about the place of women, and she paid for it, with banishment and disgrace and the loss of her family, exactly as a woman who stepped out of her appointed place could expect to pay. But she made it, and she held to it, and in doing so she claimed a kind of freedom that few women of her age ever tasted. There is a quiet feminism in Mary's story, though she would not have known the word, a small but real assertion of a woman's right to her own heart and her own life against a world that denied her both. She was not a born rebel, not a champion of her sex, not a figure who changed the conditions of women's lives. She was one woman who, in one matter at great cost, insisted on choosing her own path. But that insistence, set against the vast powerlessness of women in her age, shines all the brighter for its rarity, and it makes Mary, for all her obscurity, a figure worth remembering and even celebrating. In a world that used women and discarded them, that allowed them no voice and no choice, that valued them only for their usefulness to men, Mary Boleyn claimed, for one shining moment, the right to live for herself, to love where she chose, to direct her own destiny. And she was proved right, in the end, in the most complete and devastating way, when the path she had chosen kept her alive while the choices made for her sister by the great men of the realm destroyed her. The woman who chose her own way survived. The woman who was used by others died. There is no clearer verdict on the worth of a woman's freedom than that, for she did not grovel, did not abjectly repent of her marriage, did not promise to be guided by her betters in future. Instead, even as she begged for help, she defended what she had done with a steady and luminous conviction that shines across the centuries. She acknowledged that the age thought she had married badly, that William Stafford was a man of small fortune and no great name, that she had thrown herself away by the reckoning of her ambitious family, but she would not pretend to regret it. She loved him, she said, and love had been her reason, and she would rather, she wrote, beg her bread with him than be the greatest queen in Christendom without him. She had seen what the pursuit of greatness brought, and she had chosen otherwise, and she stood by it. To be a poor man's wife, secure in love, was better, she had concluded, than to be a queen and at the mercy of fortune's wheel. Consider the courage and the clarity of that, set in its moment. She wrote these words while her sister was still Queen of England, still at the height of her power, before the catastrophe that would prove Mary so terribly right. From where she stood, at the moment of writing, her choice looked like folly and her sister's like triumph. Anne wore the crown. Her sister was disgraced and poor, and yet Mary, in her disgrace, declared that she would not change places with her royal sister, that the love of her poor soldier was worth more than all the grandeur of the throne. It was a judgment that flew in the face of everything her world believed, everything her family had lived for, and it would have seemed to most who read it the rationalization of a woman who had ruined herself. But within 2 years the wheel of fortune would turn, and Anne would lose her head, and Mary's judgment would stand revealed as the truest wisdom anyone in her family ever showed. She had said she would rather be a poor man's wife, and sure, than a queen and a casualty, and the event proved her right beyond all argument. There is something almost prophetic in Mary's words, though she could not have known it, an insight that ran deeper than mere preference, and it is this that lifts her letter from a personal plea into something close to a statement of values for the ages. She had grasped, this overlooked and underestimated woman, a truth that her clever and ambitious family never understood, that the things people prize most, splendor and power and position, are also the most precarious and the most dangerous, held at the mercy of forces beyond control, while the humbler goods of love and security and peace, though the proud despise them, are what truly sustain a life and endure. Her family staked everything on the grand and the precarious, and lost it all. She chose the modest and the safe, and kept it to the end of her days. Her letter is the manifesto of that decision, the clearest expression we have of the wisdom that saved her, and it remains, 5 centuries on, a moving testament to the enduring worth of love over splendor, of the heart over the prizes of ambition. For Mary's banishment, which had seemed at the time like the final ruin of her fortunes, turned out to be her salvation, the very act that saved her life. She had been cast out of the court in disgrace, sent away to live in obscurity with her unsuitable husband, cut off from the glittering centre of power, and so, when the catastrophe came, she was not there. In the spring of the year 1536, the whole world of the Boleyns came crashing down in a matter of weeks, with a speed and a brutality that stunned all of Europe. The king, his obsession with Anne, long since curdled into resentment, and desperate now for the son she had failed to give him, turned upon his queen with sudden and annihilating force. Anne was arrested, accused of monstrous and almost certainly invented crimes, of adultery with several men, and of plotting the king's death. She was tried and condemned, and on a May morning she was beheaded within the walls of the Tower of London, the Queen of England, the woman for whom the king had broken with Rome and remade his kingdom, was destroyed in less than 3 years upon the throne. And she did not fall alone, for among the men accused of being her lovers and condemned and executed alongside her was her own brother, George Boleyn, Mary's brother, charged with the grotesque and baseless crime of incest with his sister. In a matter of days, Mary lost both her sister and her brother to the executioner, the two siblings who had risen so high, brought down together in horror and disgrace. The catastrophe that destroyed Mary's family in the spring of 1536 was so sudden and so total that it stunned all who witnessed it, and since Mary's survival turns entirely upon her absence from it, it is worth understanding how the Boleyn ascendancy came crashing down. By the early months of that year, his passion for Anne, the obsession for which he had remade his kingdom, had soured into resentment and disappointment. She had given him a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth, but not the son he craved above all things, and she had miscarried of a boy at the start of that fateful year, a blow that seems to have convinced him that this marriage, like his first, was cursed and barren. Proud and sharp-tongued, she had made enemies at every turn, and her position, which had always depended entirely on the royal favour, grew suddenly precarious as that favour turned cold. His eye, too, had already begun to wander toward another woman, the quiet and gentle Jane Seymour, who would become his third wife within days of Anne's death. The stage was set for a fall, and the ministers, sensing which way the wind was blowing, moved to bring the Queen down. What followed was a judicial murder of breathtaking ruthlessness, carried through with a speed that left no time for mercy or reflection. Anne was accused of adultery with a number of men of the court, and not merely adultery but treason, for to lie with the Queen was to imperil the succession and threaten the king. The charges were almost certainly false, fabricated to destroy her, built on flimsy evidence and forced confessions and the testimony of frightened men. Among those accused of being her lovers were several courtiers, and most monstrously of all her own brother George, charged with incest, a charge so grotesque and so obviously trumped up that it shocked even that hard age. The accused men were tried and condemned, and then Anne herself was tried before a court that included her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and found guilty and sentenced to death. The whole thing, from the first arrests to the final executions, took less than 3 weeks. George Boleyn, Mary's brother, died first among the principals, beheaded with the other condemned men on Tower Hill, going to his death with courage and dignity, protesting the injustice of his fate. And then, 2 days later, on a May morning, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was beheaded within the walls of the Tower of London by a swordsman brought specially from France for the purpose, dying with a composure and a grace that impressed all who saw it. The woman for whom the king had defied the Pope and broken with Rome and remade his kingdom, who had risen so dazzlingly high, was dead less than 3 years after her coronation, her body bundled into an arrow chest for want of a proper coffin and buried hastily in the chapel within the tower walls. The great Boleyn ascendancy, the climb of generations, ended in a matter of weeks in blood and disgrace, with 2 of the 3 Boleyn siblings dead upon the scaffold, and the family's name a byword for ruin. The whole thing was over almost before the court could draw breath. In the space of 19 days, a crowned queen and 5 men, one of them her brother, were accused, condemned, and killed, and the family that had stood at the summit of the realm was reduced to ruin and silence. It was a demonstration, swift and terrible, of how absolute the king's power had become and how little the favour that raised the Boleyns had ever truly been worth. Those who had basked in their ascendancy now hurried to distance themselves. Those who had courted them now looked away, and in the countryside, far from the tower and the scaffold and the frightened whispering of the court, the one Boleyn who had already been cast out went quietly about her days, not yet knowing, perhaps, how narrowly the storm had passed her by. For the catastrophe that swallowed her family reached out for everyone who stood near its centre, and the remarkable fact of Mary's life is precisely that she did not. And Mary, the discarded one, the banished one, was spared. Because she had been cast out, because she had married her soldier for love and been sent away in disgrace, she was nowhere near the catastrophe when it struck. She was not at court to be caught up in the accusations, not in the Queen's circle to be swept into the destruction, not a player in the deadly game that consumed her brother and sister. The very thing that had seemed her ruin, the banishment for marrying beneath her, had placed her safely out of reach of the disaster that annihilated her family. There is a terrible irony in it, and a kind of rough justice too, for the sister who had been judged to have disgraced the family by following her heart was the only one of the 3 Boleyn siblings to survive. Anne, who had reached for the crown, lost her head. George, who had risen with her, lost his. And Mary, who had thrown it all away for love, who had been cast out and forgotten, remained. She had chosen the poor man and the simple life over the grandeur and the danger, and the grandeur and the danger had destroyed everyone who chose them, while the simple life had kept her safe. Of Mary's last years, after the catastrophe, we know little, for she passed them in exactly the obscurity she had chosen, far from the court and its deadly games, at peace with her William Stafford, the husband she had given up all else to wed. When her father, Thomas Boleyn, was gone a few years later, his great ambitions all turned to ashes. His climb to glory ending in the ruin of his children, she inherited some of the family property, and she and Stafford lived out their days in modest comfort in the countryside, raising her children, tending their land, living the small and human and peaceful life that she had chosen over the dazzle of the court. It was not a grand life, not a life that left much mark on the records of the age, but it was a life which was more than her brother and sister had been left, and by every sign that survives, it was a contented one, a life of love and quiet and safety, lived with the man she had wanted, far from the storms that had destroyed her family. Mary Boleyn died in the year 1543, in her early or middle 40s, of natural causes, in her bed, in obscurity and peace, having outlived her famous sister by 7 years and her brother by the same, having survived the catastrophe that took them, having lived to a calm and natural death that not one of the grand and ambitious members of her family was granted. The years that she spent in obscurity after her banishment, the quiet years with William Stafford away from the court, are the least documented of her whole life, and yet in their very emptiness they tell us something precious, for the absence of record is itself the sign of the peace she had found. The lives that fill the history books are the dramatic ones, the lives of those who rose high and fell hard, who schemed and fought and died spectacularly, and the Boleyns gave history a feast of such drama. But Mary, after her banishment, vanishes almost entirely from the record, and that vanishing is not a loss but a kind of victory, for it means she was living the obscure and peaceful life she had chosen, far from the dramas that consume the chronicles, raising her children, keeping her household, loving her husband, doing the small, ordinary things that leave no mark on history, but that make up the substance of a contented life. We can imagine, even if we cannot document, what those years were like. After the storms of her earlier life, the French court and the king's bed, and the dazzle and danger of the Boleyn ascendancy, she came at last to rest in the English countryside, in a modest establishment, far from the centres of power. There would have been the round of country life, the management of a household and an estate, the rhythms of the seasons, the raising of her children, the company of her husband. It would have been a small life by the standards of her family, a life of no great wealth or consequence, but it would have been her own, chosen freely, lived in peace and in love, and there is every sign that it was a happy one. The marriage to Stafford, made in such defiance and at such cost, seems to have been a genuine and lasting love match, and the two of them lived out their years together in the calm contentment that she had chosen over all the grandeur of the court. When her father was gone, a broken and diminished man, his ambitions ruined and his children dead, Mary inherited some of the Boleyn property, and this brought her and Stafford a measure of comfort and security in their later years, lifting them above the poverty that her banishment had threatened. It is a small irony that the family wealth, accumulated through all those generations of scheming ambition, came at last to the daughter, who had wanted none of it, who had been cast out for despising it, and who used it not to climb or to scheme, but simply to live in peace. They were not grand, but they were comfortable enough, settled, secure, and they had what the rest of the family, for all their grandeur, had lost or never found, which was each other, and safety, and time. And it is worth pausing, as we near the end of her story, on the rare and precious thing that Mary achieved in those quiet years, for it was rarer in her court than any crown. She grew old. She lived to see her hair grey, watch her children grow, to share the long companionship of a marriage that lasted, to die in her own bed of natural causes in the fullness of her years. This sounds like nothing, the most ordinary of fates, and yet in the deadly arena of the Tudor court, it was the rarest of achievements, denied to her brilliant sister and her brave brother, and so many others who reached too high. To grow old in peace, surrounded by those one loves, and to die quietly in one's bed, was a fate that the grand and the ambitious of that age, for all their power, could rarely secure. And Mary, the failure, the outcast, the forgotten one, achieved it where they did not. Her untroubled years, undocumented and unremarkable, were in truth her greatest triumph, the proof that her choice had been the right one, the long and gentle reward for the courage of her heart. And here at the very end comes the secret I promised you at the start, the strange and wonderful turn that lifts Mary's gentle tale into something remarkable. For of all the Boleyns, all the brilliant, ambitious, doomed Boleyns who reached so high and fell so far, it was Mary, the forgotten one, the discarded elder, whose descent endured and ran on to the greatest height of all. Her sister Anne had a single child, the daughter who became Queen Elizabeth I, and there that branch ended, for Elizabeth never married and left no heir of her body. But Mary had children, and they had children after them, and her descent ran on, down through the generations by paths that no one in the 16th century could have foreseen, until at last it reached the throne itself. The kings and queens of England today come down not from the famous one who wore the crown and lost her head, but from the forgotten one who wed for love and lived in peace. The crown that Anne reached for and died for passed, in the end, through the line of the sister she had eclipsed and banished. It is one of history's most perfect ironies, and Mary, who asked so little and was given so little in her own time, would surely have been astonished to learn that of all her glittering family, it was her own humble blood that won the greatest prize there was. How that came to pass is worth the telling, for it ran through her two children, Catherine and Henry, the pair born during her marriage to William Carey. Whatever the truth of their paternity, which we can never know, they were raised as Careys and grew up to make their own ways in the world. The son, Henry Carey, would rise in the reign of his cousin Elizabeth to wealth and a title, the founder of a noble house that endured for centuries. But it was the daughter who carried her mother's descent furthest, and her story is the gentler and the more telling of the two. Catherine Carey, Mary's daughter, made a good marriage and rose in time to a place of real consequence, for when her cousin came at last to the throne of England, the orphaned daughter of the executed Anne, she gathered about her the surviving kin of her Boleyn mother. The world that had destroyed the elder generation of Boleyns now lifted up the younger, and Catherine, the daughter of the banished sister, was carried by that turn of fortune into the very heart of the royal court. Catherine Carey served the Queen as one of her most intimate attendants, a lady of the bedchamber, close to Elizabeth in the daily intimacy of the royal household, trusted and beloved. The two cousins had much to bind them, the shared blood of the Boleyns, the memory of the family tragedy that had touched them both, the strange kinship of the daughters of the two sisters whose fates had diverged so sharply. And the Queen loved her cousin dearly, kept her close, relied upon her, so that Catherine, the daughter of the forgotten and banished sister, stood at the very centre of the court, in the intimate circle of the Queen herself. There is a deep poignancy in this, that the child of the sister who had been cast out should find her way to the heart of the court, beloved of the daughter of the sister who had done the casting out. The breach between the mothers healed in the love between the daughters. When Catherine died, in the year 1568, the Queen was stricken with a grief that astonished the whole court, mourning her with a depth of sorrow that she showed for few others in her long life. She had her buried with great honour, spared no expense upon the funeral, and grieved the loss as one of the heaviest of her reign. There is something quietly moving in that the child of the banished and forgotten sister should be cherished so dearly at the very summit of the kingdom, honoured in death with a tenderness that her mother, in her obscurity, had never known. The daughter received in full measure the love and esteem that the world had denied the mother. And Catherine was the mother of a large and thriving family, her children scattering outward into the houses of the English nobility, marrying well, prospering, carrying their grandmother's blood forward into a future that none of the doomed Boleyns of the elder generation had lived to see, where her aunt's line had narrowed to a single childless queen. Catherine's broadened with every passing decade, a wide green branching where the famous branch had withered. We shall come, in a moment, to just how far that branching would reach. For now it is enough to marvel that the obscure daughter of the obscure sister became, through her own fruitfulness, the living root of a great and spreading posterity, while the crowned and celebrated Anne left, in the end, no posterity at all. There is an old image beloved of the people of Mary's age that captures the meaning of her story better than any second, and that is the image of the Wheel of Fortune. The men and women of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance pictured fortune as a great turning wheel, on which human lives rose and fell, lifted up to the heights and then cast down to the depths as it revolved. Those who rode high upon it, the high and the fortunate, were forever in danger of being carried down again as it turned, for it never stopped, and the higher one rose, the further one had to fall. It was a vivid and a sobering image, a reminder of the instability of all earthly fortune, of the folly of trusting in the heights to which one had been raised, and it haunted the imagination of an age that saw, again and again, the mighty cast down and the proud brought low. Mary's family lived and died by its turning. They climbed to dizzy heights, lifted by the king's favour, by Anne's dazzling ascent, carried up and up until they stood at the very summit, among the highest in the land. Thomas Boleyn became an earl, Anne became a queen. The whole family rode high, basking in their elevation. And then it turned, as it always turned, and they were cast down into ruin and disgrace and death. Anne and George to the scaffold. They had ridden to the highest point, and from that height they fell the furthest, dashed to pieces in the reversal that destroyed them. It was the oldest story there is, the climb and the inevitable plunge, the heights that lead only to a steeper descent. But Mary, alone among her family, stepped off it. This is the deepest meaning of her choice, the quality that sets her apart from all her doomed kin. When she married William Stafford for love and was cast out into obscurity, she removed herself from fortune's turning altogether, climbed down from the dangerous heights to which her family clung, and planted her feet on the solid ground of ordinary life. She would not ride up to the heights, and so she could not be carried down to the depths. She gave up the chance of grandeur, and with it the danger of catastrophe. While her family rode to the summit and then to ruin, Mary stood safely on the ground, watching it turn, untouched by its terrible revolutions. It was not that fortune favoured her over her family. It was that she had taken herself out of fortune's reach, had refused the game of rise and fall, and so survived while the players were destroyed. There is a profound wisdom in this, the wisdom of stepping off it, and it is the heart of what her life has to teach. The pursuit of grandeur, of height, of the dizzy summits of wealth and power and position, is also the pursuit of danger, for what rises must fall, and the higher the rise, the harder the fall. The only true safety lies in not climbing too high, in being content with the solid ground of ordinary life, in valuing the things that do not depend on the turning of fortune's wheel, love and peace and the calm contentment of a life lived on a human scale. Mary's family never understood this. They climbed, and the wheel destroyed them. Mary understood it, whether by wisdom or by instinct or by the lessons of her own hard experience, and she stepped off the wheel and was saved. Her story is, in the end, a meditation on fortune and its dangers, a quiet argument for the ground over the heights, for the safety of the humble over the peril of the grand, and it speaks across the centuries to anyone who has ever wondered whether the prizes the world offers are worth the dangers they carry. We must be honest, as we tell Mary's story, about how much of it we do not know, for the gaps in her tale are vast, and they are themselves a part of who she was, and how she has come down to us. Mary Boleyn left almost no trace of her own in the records of her age. We have no portrait of which we can be certain, no likeness that we know for sure shows her face, so that we cannot even say with confidence what she looked like. We have only a handful of documents that mention her, a few references in the records, the single precious letter in which we hear her own voice. The dates of her birth and even of the large events of her life are uncertain, debated by historians, pieced together from scraps and inferences. Whole years of her life are blank, undocumented, lost to us entirely. She moves through her own story like a half-glimpsed figure, present but indistinct, known more by her connections to the famous than by anything we can securely say of herself. This obscurity is partly the common fate of women in her age, whose lives so often went unrecorded, but in Mary's case it is deepened by the particular shape of her story, by her retreat from the wide stage into the calm of obscurity. The famous leave records, the obscure do not. Anne Boleyn, at the centre of great events, generated a vast documentation, letters and reports and chronicles, the whole apparatus of record that attends the powerful and the notorious. Mary, who withdrew from the centre, who lived quietly in the countryside far from the large events, generated almost nothing, left almost no mark, and so has come down to us as a faint outline, a figure we must reconstruct from fragments and guesses. The very choice that saved her, the retreat into obscurity, is the choice that has hidden her from history, that has rendered her so dim and indistinct in the record. And yet there is something fitting, even something fine, in this dimness, for it is the dimness of a life lived away from the deadly glare of power, and that glare, as her family learned, was a perilous station to stand. The brightness of the record that surrounds Anne is the brightness of catastrophe, the documentation of a tragedy. The shadow that surrounds Mary is the shadow of peace, the hush of a life that generated no drama because it held no disaster. We know so little of her later years precisely because they were happy and uneventful, lived in the safe retirement she had chosen, far from the events that fill the chronicles. The blank in her tale is the stillness of contentment, and if we could choose, for ourselves or for those we love, between the loud record of a tragedy and the hush of a peaceful life, we would surely choose the hush. Her obscurity is the price and the proof of her wisdom, the shadow cast by the very safety she had won. So we are left to imagine much of Mary, to reconstruct her from fragments, to fill the blanks with our own sympathy and our own guesses. We do not know her face, her voice, the details of her daily life, the texture of her years with William Stafford. We know only the bare outline of her life, the shape of her choices, the single letter in which her spirit shines through, but perhaps that is enough. Perhaps we do not need the details to grasp the essence of her, the woman who chose love over grandeur, who stepped off the wheel of fortune, who survived where her family was destroyed, who found, in obscurity, the peace that eluded the great. The silences in her story leave room for our imagination and our sympathy, invite us to fill them with the quiet happiness we hope she found, and in the end, the half-glimpsed figure of Mary Boleyn, indistinct and obscure, may move us more than the fully documented tragedy of her famous sister, precisely because we must reach toward her through the quiet, and reaching, come to care for the forgotten sister whom history left in the shadows. And so we arrive, by the longest of roads, at the quiet vindication of the forgotten sister. We have already glimpsed the wonder of it, how the crown that Anne reached for and died for came down, in the end, through Mary and not through her, but it bears sitting with for a moment longer. Anne won the throne and lost everything, but the dazzling branch withered to a single childless queen, and then was gone. Mary won not one thing the world could see, and her line ran on and on, widening and deepening through the centuries until it watered the roots of the monarchy itself. The one who lost the great game of grandeur turned out to have won the only game that lasts, the slow, patient game of life carried forward into the future, and she won it without ever knowing she had played. Think on the strangeness and the justice of it. The whole tragedy of the Boleyns was driven by the desperate desire for advancement, for grandeur, for the founding of an enduring name. Thomas Boleyn schemed and climbed for it. Anne reached for the very crown to secure it, and it all ended in blood and extinction, the proud ambitions annihilated, the famous house dying out within a generation. And meanwhile Mary, who wanted none of it, who threw away her advantages for love and was cast out and forgotten, who built no monument and sought no height, became, without ever knowing it, the true mother of the descent that endured, the inheritance her family prized so highly that they schemed and died to advance, flowed on into the future, not through the proud and the ambitious, but through the humble and the loving, not through the sister who wore the crown, but through the one who married for love and lived in peace. It is the final proof of her wisdom that in turning away from the splendour that destroyed her kin, she secured, all unknowing, the one kind of immortality that splendour could never buy. There is a question that hangs over Mary's whole life, and it is worth facing directly, for it tells us something about the past itself and about the kinds of lives that get remembered and which slip away. Why is Mary Boleyn so little known when her sister is among the most famous women England has produced? The answer is simple, and it is troubling, for Mary is forgotten precisely because her tale is one of deep wisdom and deep happiness, and the chronicles do not much remember such things. What they remember is drama, catastrophe, spectacle. It remembers those who climbed to dizzy heights and fell to bloody ruin, those whose lives were full of incident and tragedy and grand passion. Anne Boleyn is remembered because hers is a sweeping drama, a dazzling rise and a shocking fall, a queen beheaded, a kingdom remade. Mary is forgotten because her life, in its essentials, is the tale of a woman who made a wise choice and lived simply and died in peace. And there's no drama in that, nothing to seize the imagination of the chroniclers, nothing to make a legend of. This tells us something important and a little sad about the way we remember the past, about its bias toward the spectacular and away from the quietly good. The names that fill our histories are disproportionately the dramatic ones, the figures of conflict and catastrophe, the high and the powerful and the doomed. The peaceful existences, full of ordinary contentment, of wise choices and gentle endings, leave little trace and are easily forgotten, however admirable they may have been. We remember the queen who lost her head and forget the sister who kept hers, recall the grand tragedy and overlook the gentle wisdom, and in doing so we may absorb, without quite realizing it, a distorted sense of what matters and what is worth seeking in a life. The records teach us, by their very selection, to value the dramatic over the peaceful, the splendid over the good, the spectacular failure over the peaceful success. But if we look again, with clearer eyes, we may come to see that the forgotten life is in truth the more enviable one, that the gentle wisdom history overlooks is worth more than the grand drama it celebrates. For when all is said and done, what would any of us truly wish for? The dazzling ascent and the bloody fall, or the tender love and the peaceful end? We may be fascinated by the tragedy of Anne, may find it endlessly compelling, yet few of us would actually choose her fate over her sister's. To be remembered for a great tragedy is a poor exchange for a life cut short in horror, and the obscurity that swallowed Mary is a small price for the years of love and peace that she enjoyed and Anne was denied. The verdict of history, which exalts the one and overlooks the other, is in a sense exactly backward, celebrating the life that ended in ruin and passing over the one that ended in contentment. And there is a rough justice in setting Mary back in her place and honouring the wisdom of what she did. And there is something fitting, too, in the fact that her vindication, when it comes not through fame but through endurance, not through the loud verdict of the chroniclers, but through the stubborn persistence of her dissent. She was passed over by the record keepers, overlooked by the histories, kept always in the shadow of her famous sister. Yet her posterity endured where Anne's failed, ran on into the future when the proud descent of the crowned queen died out. It is as if history, having denied her the fame it gave her sister, granted her instead a deeper kind of immortality, not the immortality of legend but of life itself, flowing on through the centuries. The forgotten one was remembered, in the end, not in the pages of the chronicles, but in the veins of the living, and that, perhaps, is the truest remembrance of all, and the most enviable, far better than the renown that attends a tragedy. Let us set the two side by side one last time, For in the contrast between Mary and Anne lies the whole meaning of this tale, and their destinies, seen together, illuminate each other as nothing else can. They began alike, born of the same parents, raised in the same household at Hever, sent both to be finished at the French court, drawn both into the orbit of the same king. From that common root their paths diverged, and the divergence is the heart of the matter. Anne reached for everything, for the crown itself, refusing to settle for less than the highest prize, playing the bold game of ambition with consummate skill and nerve. Mary reached for little, taking what came, and at last, in her one decisive act, reaching not for grandeur but for love. Two women, two paths, two utterly different fates, springing from a single beginning, and how far they diverged. Anne climbed to the summit of the realm, Queen of England, the most celebrated and envied woman in the land, the cause for which a king remade his country. Mary sank into obscurity, a discarded mistress and then a banished wife, living unseen in the countryside. By every measure of their own age, the one soared and the other failed, and then fortune turned, as it always turns, and the triumph curdled into catastrophe, while the failure ripened into salvation. Anne, at the height, was destroyed, her crown the cause of her death, her splendour the very thing that doomed her. Mary below was safe, her smallness her shield. The one who soared was dashed to pieces. The one who sank endured, and the whole judgment of their age was overturned by the event. There is no cruelty in setting their fates against each other, for it is not that Mary was better than Anne, wiser or worthier in any moral sense. Anne was the more brilliant of the two, the more gifted, the more remarkable, a woman of dazzling qualities, who played a notable part in the history of her nation. Her tragedy was not a punishment for any fault, but the working out of the dangers built into the road she chose, the road of splendour and ambition, and the reaching after the highest prizes. And Mary's survival was no reward for special virtue, but the natural fruit of the safer way she took, the way of obscurity and love, and a smaller, gentler life. The contrast is not a verdict, but a demonstration, a showing forth of the different ends that attend the different roads, the peril of the heights and the safety of the ground, written in two women who began together and finished so far apart. But if there is no cruelty in the contrast, there is a deep and abiding poignancy, for these were sisters who loved one another once, who began life together in the gardens of Hever, and who were divided at the last by the brutal workings of their realm, the one to die upon the scaffold, and the other to live in obscurity, the bond between them broken and never healed. When Anne went to her death, Mary was far away, banished and disgraced, and whatever grief she felt for her sister she felt alone, in obscurity, unable to help or to mourn openly. The two sisters, who had shared so much, ended utterly apart, the one in a hasty grave within the tower, the other in a still country house, divided in death as the last years of their lives had divided them. It is a sorrowful end to the tale of their sisterhood, and it reminds us that for all the wisdom of Mary's choices and the folly of Anne's, the deepest truth of their story is simply the tragedy of two sisters torn apart by a world too brutal for the bonds of love, the one destroyed by her grandeur and the other saved by her obscurity, but both in their different ways, the victims of the same merciless age. When we gather up the whole of Mary's story and ask what it means, what verdict we should pass on this overlooked and underestimated woman, we arrive at a conclusion that turns the judgments of her own age entirely on their head. By the standards of her world, Mary was a failure, and her family certainly judged her so. She reached no great height, she wore no crown, held no office, wielded no power. She made, by the reckoning of her ambitious kin, two poor uses of her royal connection becoming a discarded mistress and then throwing herself away on an unsuitable marriage. She was cast out, disgraced, forgotten, the daughter who disappointed, the sister who fell short, the one who failed to make anything of the rare chances her birth and her beauty had given her. In the cold accounting of the Boleyns, Mary was the failure of the family, and the verdict of her own age would have agreed. But by the only standards that truly matter, the standards of a life well and happily remained, Mary was the true success of her family, the only one of them who got the important matters right. For what, in the end, is a life for? Is it for splendour, for height, for the dizzy summits of wealth and power that her kin pursued so relentlessly and that destroyed them all? Or is it for love, for peace, for the calm contentment of belonging among those one cares for, free from fear, ending in a gentle and natural death? By the first measure she failed, and her family triumphed, however briefly. By the second, which is surely the truer one, she triumphed and they failed utterly. She found love and kept it. She found peace and held it. She grew old surrounded by those she cherished, and went easily at the last. Her brilliant sister, her ambitious brother, her scheming father, for all their splendour, found none of these things, but only the brief intoxication of height followed by the long horror of the fall. The verdict we should pass on her, then, is one of deep admiration, even of a kind of envy, for she got right what her clever family got so disastrously wrong, the fundamental question of what to seek in a life. She grasped, whether by judgment or by instinct, that the prizes ambition offers, the splendour and the power and the position, are not worth the dangers they carry, and that the true goods are the humbler ones, love and peace and safety, which do not depend on the favour of kings or the turning of fortune, and she had the courage to act on it, to turn her back on those prizes, and take the gentler path, even at the cost of disgrace and banishment and the loss of her kin. It took real nerve, real strength of character, and it was vindicated beyond all argument by the event, when the path she chose kept her alive while the paths her family chose destroyed them. There is, in the end, something almost saintly in Mary's hard-won insight, though she was no saint, just an ordinary woman who happened to get the central question right. She did not preach or theorize or set herself up as an example. She simply lived, and in living chose love over grandeur, peace over glory, the humble and the secure over the dazzling and the dangerous. And in making that choice, she became, without ever intending it, a kind of silent rebuke to the values of her age, and of every age, a living argument for what truly matters against what only seems to. The sphere remembers her famous sister and forgets her, celebrates the grand tragedy and overlooks the gentle wisdom. But those who know her story, who look past the fame of the one sister to the wisdom of the other, may come away with something more valuable than a tale of grandeur and catastrophe. They may come away with a deep lesson about how to live, and how not to, drawn from the contrast between two sisters, the one who reached for the crown and lost her head, and the one who reached for love and kept her life. So that is the story of Mary Boleyn, the sister history forgot, and when we look at the whole shape of it, there is a strange and gentle wisdom in it that is worth carrying with you into sleep. She was not the cleverest of her family, nor the most ambitious, nor the most celebrated. She reached no great height, wore no crown, left no great mark upon the records of her age. By every measure that her world prized, she was the failure of her family, the one who threw away her advantages, who disgraced herself for love, who ended in obscurity, and yet she was the one who lived, the one who found love and kept it, the one who died in peace in her bed while the grand and the ambitious perished on the scaffold, and she was the one whose blood, in the end, endured. There is a lesson in that, if we want one, about what truly lasts and what only seems to matter, about the deep wisdom of choosing love over grandeur, and peace over glory. But you need not take any lesson from it at all. You need only carry with you into the gentle dark the image of the forgotten sister who chose the poor man she loved over the greatest crown in Christendom, and was proved in the fullness of time to have chosen well. If you have found something restful here tonight, in this slow and gentle walk through a life lived so long ago, then you are very welcome to subscribe before you go, so that the next of these long evenings finds its way to you when you have need of one. Wherever you are in the world tonight, and whatever the hour, I hope the dark is kind to you, and the bed is warm, and the morning, when it comes, is gentle. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.